The armory smelled of oil and cold metal, and Sergeant Dane Holloway held her hands up to the fluorescent light like evidence at a trial. "Look at these," he said, loud enough for the whole line to hear. "You could palm a walnut and lose it. These are not the hands of a shooter, Private. These are hands for folding laundry." Corporal Nadia Fern did not pull them back. She let him turn her wrists over, let him showcase the narrowness of her fingers to the 6 men waiting to draw their weapons. Her face stayed flat as still water. She was watching something he could not see. The way his own trigger finger carried a faint tremor he'd learned to hide. The way he favored his right shoulder from an old strain. She catalogued it the way some people breathe. Then she took her hands back, slow, and said nothing at all. What Holloway didn't know, what the file in the company office knew, and he had never bothered to read, was that those small hands had rebuilt a jammed bolt in total darkness under 3 feet of snowmelt, that they had threaded a broken firing pin back into a receiver by feel alone, while a storm erased the world outside. He saw the size of them. He never once considered what they could do. In 11 days, those same hands would do something in front of him that he would spend the rest of his life failing to explain, and the first thing he would remember was this moment, this cruelty, this light. She did not yet know it either. She only knew the armory was cold, and that the work was the work. If you've ever been measured by the smallest thing about you and found wanting, stay with me, because this one travels a long way from this room. Subscribe if you haven't. Drop the name of your city in the comments so I know where you're listening from, and stick to the end. There's a moment 11 days out where a man who never says her name is forced to say it into a radio in front of 40 people, and I don't want you to miss what his voice does when he does. Now let me take you back. The fire base sat in a high desert bowl in the eastern ranges, a scatter of connexes and sandbag walls where the wind came off the ridgelines, carrying grit fine as flour. It got into everything: the rice, the rifle actions, the corners of your eyes. Nadia Fern had been there 4 months, and most of the base still called her the small one when they called her anything. She was 5'3" and quiet in a way that made loud men uncomfortable, and she moved through the camp like she was trying not to disturb the air. She had learned rifles from a woman named Signa Aldous, and Sina was still alive, which mattered. Sina ran a shooting range and a scrap metal yard on the flat plains where Nadia grew up, a big-shouldered woman in her 60s who swore like a burst pipe and had no patience for reverence. She did not teach Nadia to listen to the quiet. She taught her the opposite. "The wind's a liar, and your eyes are worse," Sina used to bark, walking the firing line with a coffee going cold in her fist. "Trust your hands. Hands don't panic. Build the thing in the dark until the dark is the same as the light, and then you'll never need to see the thing you're fixing." She made Nadia strip actions blindfolded until her fingers bled, and then made her do it again. Faster, timing her with a kitchen egg timer she'd throw at the fence when Nadia was slow. There was no philosophy in it. There was only the drill, over and over, until competence lived in the bone. When Nadia had shipped out, Sina hadn't given her a keepsake. She'd given her a habit. The habit of closing her eyes before hard work and letting her hands wake up first. And a phone number she was supposed to call and never did, because there was never anything to report yet. That was the thing about Nadia. She was waiting for something worth reporting. The morning after the armory, the base held a marksmanship qualification, and it went the way these things went. Holloway ran the line like a showman. He was, to be fair to him, genuinely good. A career shooter, with a wall of scores behind him, which was exactly what made his cruelty a decision rather than an accident. He called out corrections that were half instruction and half performance. When Nadia's turn came, he announced her group before she fired, predicting she'd throw rounds low and left on account of the recoil bullying her around. She put 5 rounds into a cluster you could cover with a bottle cap. Holloway looked at the target a long moment, then said the wind had done her a favor and moved on. A specialist named Toomey, 19 and new, and still capable of being impressed, stared from the scoring pit and said under his breath, "That's not the wind." Nobody heard him. He'd remember it anyway. Nadia had an ally on that base, and it wasn't a bright-eyed spotter half her age. It was a man named Emeka Osei, a broad, unhurried sergeant who ran the observation post on the north wall and had 30 years of reading ground behind slow brown eyes. Osei had been passed over for things smaller men got, and he knew the particular exhaustion of being underestimated by people with less patience and more volume. He'd watched Nadia work for a month before he said a word to her. The word, when it came, was, "Your hands know something your file doesn't say." She'd looked at him, surprised, and almost smiled. That was the beginning of it. They fell into a rhythm at the north post, the 2 quiet ones. He'd read the far ground, and she'd read the near, and between them they missed nothing. Osei had his own dismissal to carry. A lieutenant had told him that same week that observation was a young man's game with old man's eyes, and Osei had simply nodded and gone back to seeing everything that lieutenant couldn't. He was not junior to Nadia. He was her equal, and the rare thing between them was that each knew it about the other. Late one evening, sharing tea gone lukewarm on the wall, Osei told her about his daughter's wedding he'd missed, and she told him about Sina's egg timer sailing over the fence, and for a few minutes 2 people who never let anything show let something show. It was the only time either of them would. Then, on the 11th day, the routine broke. It came over the net at 0400 as a contact report from a convoy escort 12 kilometers south. A supply run pinned in a wadi called Sinker's Cut, ambushed at the narrow point where the walls rose sheer and the road bent blind. The relief element was 30 minutes out at best. The convoy had wounded and no elevation, and the ridge above them was crawling with shooters who had the high ground and all the time in the world. Captain Rayland Voss ran the operations shack, and Voss had spent 4 months letting Holloway set the tone on his base because it was easier than fighting him. He stood over the map now with the radio hissing casualty counts, and he knew, with the sick clarity of a man who has avoided a decision until it avoids him, exactly who on his base could reach that ridge. He'd read the file, even if he'd pretended not to. He keyed the net to the north wall. Fern. A pause that cost him something. "I need your hands on that ridge. Not anyone else's. Yours." It was the first time he'd used her name, without a qualifier, in front of it. Every man in the shack heard the admission underneath it, that the person he needed was the person his best sergeant had spent 4 months making small. "Moving," Nadia said. One word, flat and certain, and it landed in the shack like a different language from everything they'd been told to expect from her. She and Osei took a fast vehicle to the shoulder of high ground west of Sinker's Cut, a shale finger that overlooked the wadi from 800 meters and change. She went up the last stretch on her belly with the long rifle across her forearms, while Osei found a hide and got glass on the far wall. Below and across, in the gray pre-dawn, The convoy sat crippled in the cut, and the ridgeline above it winked with muzzle flash. "Talk to me," Nadia breathed. 12, maybe more, along the top rim," Osei said, voice low and even. "They've got a machine gun working the lead truck from that notch. That's your problem, child." She closed her eyes for 1 second and let her hands wake up on the rifle. Then she opened them. The machine gunner never heard the shot that reached him. The rifle's report rolled down the valley a half-second behind the impact, and the notch went quiet. 1, Osei said. She was already shifting to the next flash. The second man was moving, scrambling along the rim toward better cover, and she led him the way Sina had drilled into her with tin cans on wires. Put the round where the man will be, not where he is. And he folded mid-stride and did not get up. 2. Then the ridge learned it was being hunted, and everything got harder at once. Rounds began cracking back across the 800 meters, snapping over the shale, walking closer as someone up there found the general line of her hide. Grit kicked into her face. "They've got a shooter on you," Osei said, calm as a man reading a grocery list. But she heard the tightening in it. "High notch. You're 11 o'clock. He's ranging." This was the first time the day tried to kill her. A round struck the shale a hand's width from her shoulder and threw stone chips that stung her cheek like wasps, and she felt the next one before she heard it, felt the air of it part above her spine as she pressed flat into the earth. Her whole body wanted to move. Sina's voice came instead, not gentle, a bark from a cold plains morning. "Trust your hands. Hands don't panic." She did not move her body. She moved only her hands, walking the rifle a fraction left onto the high notch, and she breathed out slow and let the tremor in the world settle into her palms and go still. She saw the faint shift of a shoulder in the notch as the enemy shooter rose to fire again. She got there first. 3, Osei said quietly. "That was the one who could have killed you." She said nothing. She was already counting flashes. The relief element checked in, still 15 minutes out. 15 minutes was a long time in a wadi with wounded. She worked the rim methodically, and the count climbed the way water climbs a wall in a flood, steady and merciless. 4 came off a rock where he thought the angle protected him. It didn't. 5 and 6 were together at the machine gun the first man had abandoned, and she took them before they got it feeding. The long rifle ran dry, and she rolled to the side and reloaded by feel without looking down, eyes still on the rim, hands doing what hands do, and Osei made a sound that might have been the start of a laugh in another life. 7, 8, 9, he called as she came back on and found them again. "They're pulling back from the rim. You've broken their top cover." Below, the convoy's own guns, freed of the plunging fire, began to answer. The tide in the cut turned. Then the FARCOMs went bad. Nadia keyed for the convoy net to coordinate and got nothing, a wash of static where the wounded truck should have been. She called again. Silence. She called a third time, and in the space of that silence, she felt something she almost never let herself feel, a cold worm of dread, because a channel that should be full and isn't is the worst sound in the world. Then a voice broke through, ragged. Still here, we're still here. Hit bad up front, but we're here." She let out the breath she'd been holding. By the time the relief element rolled into Sinker's Cut, the ridge was silent, and the count Osei read out one last time was 14. The first operation, the one everyone would have called a career, was over before full light. But there was a man in the lead truck who could not wait for a medevacs bird. And that was where the second part of the morning found Nadia, not on a ridge, but on her knees in the dirt of the wadi, with her hands red to the wrist. His name was Bram Toller, a 41-year-old convoy driver from a cold northern farm town, and he had a wife named Inez, and a plan to open a bait and tackle shop when his last tour ended in the spring. A fragment had opened his thigh badly, and the truck's medic was already down. And Nadia, who had a second skill her file also failed to mention, learned in Sina's scrapyard patching men the local clinic was too far to help, got her hands on the wound, and did not let go. Bram's face had gone the gray of old paper. He grabbed her sleeve. "Am I going to make it home?" he asked. His voice was small, in a way a big man's voice should never be. "Tell me straight. Inez is waiting. Am I going to see her?" Nadia looked him dead in the eyes. She did not soften it into comfort. She made it a fact. "You're going home in the spring," she said. "You'll smell like fish, and she'll complain about it. That's happening, I've decided." Something in the certainty of it reached him, where kindness couldn't. He nodded, and he held onto her sleeve, and she kept the pressure locked with the same hands that had cleared a ridge, and she talked to him low and steady about a bait shop she'd never see until the bird came in over the ridgeline, and the medics took him from her. He was breathing when they lifted him. She stayed on her knees a moment, with her red hands open in her lap, and then she wiped them on her trousers and stood up, because the work was the work, and she thought the day was done. The day was not done. Voss came up on the net himself, and there was a new tightness in his voice that had nothing to do with Sinker's cut. "Fern, do not stand down. We have a developing situation at the crossing." He meant the Harrows Bridge. The single-span steel truss, 11 kilometers east, that carried the only road capable of taking the medevac vehicles and the relief convoy back to the field hospital. A second enemy element, the ones who'd set the ambush, had been the smaller half of a coordinated push, had reached the bridge ahead of the withdrawal and wired its central pier, and they had done something worse than simply preparing to drop it. They'd taken the 4-man engineer crew that had been inspecting the span, and they were holding them on the bridge itself, on the roadway above the wired pier, as a shield and a bargaining chip. The math was ugly, and everyone in the shack understood it at once. If the enemy blew the bridge, the wounded, Bram among them, could not cross, and the span would come down on the hostages. If a relief force stormed the bridge, the enemy would fire the charge before they got halfway. The wire ran from the pier charge up to a hand detonator held by a single man crouched at the near abutment behind a low concrete barrier, exposing nothing but a sliver of himself, and, crucially, the hand and the detonator resting on the barrier's lip. Cut that man from the switch, and the charge stayed cold. But he'd built himself a fortress out of geometry. From every ground approach, the hostages or the barrier itself covered him completely. Nadia and Osei repositioned to a stony rise north of the crossing, the only elevation with an angle onto the abutment, and even from there the problem was almost unsolvable. The distance was moderate, 400 meters, nothing for her. Distance was not the difficulty. The difficulty was the target, not a man, but a hand. The detonator man kept his body entirely behind the concrete. All that showed, all that had ever shown, was his right hand and forearm laid over the barrier's top edge with the detonator beneath his palm. And he was smart. He moved that hand constantly, tapping, shifting, never still, keeping even that sliver an unpredictable thing. "I can't take the man," Nadia said, glass to her eye. "He's not there to take. I have to take the hand off the switch without hitting the switch. If I hit the detonator, or if the hand clenches when it's hit, it fires." She was quiet a moment. "It has to be a hit that opens the hand, not closes it. And it has to happen when the hand is flat and still, not mid-tap. He's never still, Osei said. He's still for a quarter second, she answered. Every time he lays it back down flat before the next tap. Watch. This was the read that unlocked everything, and it was Osei who confirmed it. The two of them building the solution the way they'd built everything, near ground and far ground, one seeing what the other couldn't. Osei put the spotting scope on the hand and watched and counted and found the tell. It was not a rhythm you could tick off. The man's taps were random, deliberately arrhythmic. But every time, in the instant before he lifted the hand to tap again, he pressed it flat and dead still against the concrete for a fraction of a heartbeat, an involuntary anchoring, a thing his own body did without his knowing. It would not repeat on a count. It was a one-time tell each time it came, readable only in the half-second of its happening, and it had to be called live. You watch the hand, Nadia said. You call it. I can't see the flatten and hold the shot both. You have to be my eyes, on the instant. I fire on your word. She was giving away the most important quarter second of her life to another man's eyes, and she did it without hesitating, because Sina had been wrong about exactly one thing, and Osei was the proof. Sometimes the hands you trust are somebody else's. Then the radio in the shack came alive with the one voice nobody expected. Holloway had reached the crossing with the relief Element's forward vehicles, and Holloway understood, finally and completely, what the situation required and who alone could deliver it. There was a long silence on the net before he keyed up. You could hear him breathe. You could hear, in that pause, the whole 4 months of it costing him at once. Fern! His voice came out wrong, stripped of all its volume. Corporal Fern. There are 4 engineers on that bridge, and a man with his thumb on the switch, and nobody down here can reach him. I can't reach him. A breath. I'm asking you. I need your hands. There's no one else's. There's no one else who can do this. Please. 40 people heard Dane Holloway say, please, into a radio. Heard him ask the woman, whose hands he'd held up to the light, as a joke to save 4 men with those same hands. Toomey, the young specialist, was in one of those vehicles, and later he'd say the whole line went dead quiet, that grown men looked at their boots. Copy, Nadia said. That was all. She settled behind the rifle on the stony rise. 400 meters, a right hand on a concrete lip, the detonator, a black shape beneath the palm. 4 men standing roped on the span above the wired pier, with the gray river moving slow below them. She had to put a round into the meat of a moving hand. In the 1 flat quarter second, it went still. Drive it off the switch, in the direction that opened the fingers rather than clenching them, and miss the detonator sitting a thumb's width away. If she was early, he'd be mid-tap, and she'd hit nothing or hit the switch. If she was late, he'd have lifted to tap, and the round would find only concrete, and he'd know, and he'd fire. She closed her eyes and let her hands wake up. She opened them. On your call, she breathed. Osei's whole world narrowed to a hand and a scope. The wind was nothing at this range. It wasn't the wind. It was never going to be the wind. It was timing measured in the flutter of a heartbeat. The hand tapped, lifted, came down, pressed flat, and lifted before Osei could speak. Not yet, he murmured. Tapped again. Random, cruel in its randomness. Down, flat, lift. Not yet. Nadia breathed out and held the rifle so still it might have been part of the rise, her finger taking up the slack to the exact edge where thought becomes event, waiting on a word, giving the moment away, trusting. The hand came down a third time, pressed flat, held. "Now," Osei said. She was already there. The round crossed 400 meters and struck the back of the hand, square and flat, and the hand did the thing she had bet everything on. It snapped open and back off the barrier, flung clear of the detonator, and the black shape sat alone on the concrete, with no palm over it, and no thumb on it, and no bridge coming down. The engineer crew was still standing on the span. The river was still moving. The charge stayed cold. For a second, the whole net was silent. Then it wasn't. Down at the crossing, men who hadn't seen the hide, hadn't seen the scope, hadn't seen the reed, said flatly that it was impossible, that no one takes a hand off a switch at 400 meters without dropping a bridge, that the wire must have failed on its own, that the story would grow in the telling. The disbelief was loud and immediate. But the proof was already recorded. The forward vehicle Holloway rode in carried an optic with a running capture, and it had been trained on the abutment the whole time. The footage showed the hand flat, the impact, the hand opening away from the switch, the detonator sitting untouched, frame by frame, exactly as she'd called it. The recovered detonator itself, dusted and logged, bore not a mark. And the 4 engineers walked off the bridge on their own feet. Each told the same account without having heard the others. They'd watched the man's hand jump off the switch, a half-heartbeat, before they heard the shot roll across the water, and none of them had a scratch. 3 independent witnesses, a frame-by-frame capture, and an unmarked detonator. It stopped being a rumor by nightfall and started being a thing that had happened, whether men could explain it or not. Osei lowered the scope and looked at her, and did not say the count, because this one didn't have a count. He said, "That was the best call I never made. You made it." I just said the word. She almost smiled. It was the second time in 4 months, and both times had been with him. The bridge held. The convoy crossed it before noon, and Bram Toller crossed with it, alive, on his way to a spring he would in fact see. They came back to the firebase in the long gold light of late afternoon, and the armory was where it ended, because the armory was where it had begun. Nadia was cleaning the long rifle at the same bench under the same fluorescent tube when Dane Holloway came in. He stood in the doorway a while. Then he crossed to the bench, and he could not, for a long moment, get a word out. His jaw worked. His hands, big, capable, decorated hands, hung useless at his sides. "I held your hands up," he finally said, and his voice cracked on it, and he had to start over. "I held your hands up like they were nothing. In this room. Right here." He stopped. He was a man who had built a whole self out of being the loudest, sure thing in any room, and that self was coming apart in front of her, one word at a time, and it plainly cost him more than anything had ever cost him. "I've been wrong about a lot of things, and told myself I was right about all of them. I looked at your hands and I saw small. I never once—" His breath went. 4 men are home tonight because of what I couldn't see. I don't have a way to make that right. I just needed to stand here, where I did it, and say I was wrong. About your hands. About all of it. He didn't recite the list. He didn't need to. It was all there in the way he couldn't look at his own hands anymore. Nadia set down the bolt. She looked at him a long moment, and what she gave him was not forgiveness exactly, and not absolution, but something a man like him could carry. "They're just hands," she said. "Everybody's got some." 2 words passed that would have been mercy or a lecture. She gave him neither. She gave him room. Voss came in behind Holloway, and his recognition was brief, because it didn't need to be long. "Corporal, you're getting your own element and a rating to match it, and it's 4 months late. That's on me, not the paperwork." He held her eye. I stopped seeing what my base had. Won't happen again. Then he was gone, and it was done, and it was enough. Toomey, the young specialist, caught her outside as the light went flat and violet over the ridgelines. He'd been in the vehicle at the bridge. He struggled for what he wanted to say, and landed somewhere plain and true. "Bram's driver, he's got a wife named Inez," Toomey said. "She doesn't know yet what almost happened. She's just going to get her husband back in the spring and never know how close it was." He shook his head. "You're the reason a whole life just goes on like normal. I don't have a word for that." "Normal's the word," Nadia said. "That's the whole job." She called Sina that night, finally, because now there was something worth reporting. She didn't tell her the count, or the distance, or the bridge. She said, "Your egg timer paid off." On the far end of the line, across all those miles of plain, an old woman, who never got sentimental about anything, was quiet for a second, and then barked a laugh and said, "Course it did. Hands don't panic. Told you." And that was the whole conversation, and it was everything. 14 on the ridge. That was the number, whole and settled, separate from the one shot at the bridge that had no number because it wasn't about killing anything. It was about a hand coming off a switch so that 4 men could walk home. That was the difference Sina had drilled into her without ever saying it out loud. The purpose of the hands was not what they could destroy. It was what they could keep from being destroyed. Engagement complete. The wire stayed cold. The bridge still stands. Late that night, the base was quiet, and Nadia walked the north wall alone, small and unhurried, under a sky gone thick with stars, her hands loose at her sides, her eyes level on the dark ridgelines where nothing moved. 11 kilometers east, a defused charge sat in an evidence locker, unmarked. Somewhere a driver dreamed of a bait shop. And down in the barracks, a sergeant who had spent his whole life certain of the size of things, lay awake with his own hands held up in the dark above his face, turning them over, looking at them like he'd never seen hands before, and finding that everything he'd been sure of had quietly come apart, because he had watched 2 small hands do the one thing his big ones never could, and he would never again mistake the size of a thing for the truth of it.